Hey everybody, it's Angela here with our lab on learning about climate and, most importantly, the greenhouse. These two go hand in hand very well together. So, for this lab, our learning objectives are going to be to learn and explain about the greenhouse effect, to differentiate between some of the major greenhouse gases and base that on their respective atmospheric concentrations and how much they actually warm the atmosphere. And then we're going to look at fluctuations in the Earth's average temperature and look at the scientific consensus for anthropogenic climate change, which is human induced climate change, and then analyze carbon dioxide emissions in our country and in the world, and then talk about global patterns of carbon dioxide emissions with a framework to climate justice. So let's go ahead and get started on our introduction. What is weather? Weather is what we use to describe the current atmospheric conditions of a certain place. So, weather, we look out the window and we say, what's the weather today? We don't look out the window and say, what's the climate today? So, weather is something we talk about when we're considering what the weather is like at a given moment. What was the weather like today? What's the weather like tomorrow? Climate is something very different. Climate is a long term pattern of weather. Atmospheric conditions of current weather are taken and they're recorded every day. So, how do we determine climate in geography? Well, when we take 30 years of records of temperature and 30 years of records of precipitation from a certain location, we average them, and this data becomes that region's or that location's climate. So once we take 30 years of what weather looked like every day for 30 years, we average those all together, and that becomes what that region's or location's climate pattern is. Now, over 30 years, can climates change? Yes, absolutely. So, we also must account for seasonal changes as well. So, for example, some locations have 6 months of rain, whereas other locations have intermittent rain over 12 months. So, even though a certain location might get, for example, like in Oregon, they get a lot of rain in Oregon, but they only get it during a certain time of year. Whereas if you look at the southeastern United States, they get a lot of rain, but they get it all throughout the year. They get the same amount of rain actually as the state, certain parts of the state of Oregon. But whereas Oregon gets it during really mainly during winter and a little bit of fall and a little bit of the end of spring, places like the southeastern United States get that same amount of rain that Oregon, certain parts of Oregon does, except spread out all throughout the year. So the Earth's climate system is really crucial in learning and matching it up with our lives because depending on what our region's climate, what our location's climate is like, we base our lives off of that particular climate. And we've become very interdependent on our region's climate as well because it's complex and it involves conditions that have to do with the ocean, ice sheets, atmosphere, and the biosphere. And in studying the Earth's climate, scientists strive to attain and analyze the longest continuous data sets possible. So ultimately, our goal is to understand one of the greatest global issues of our time, and that's anthropogenic climate change. Anthropogenic meaning human induced. Anthro, if you've ever taken an anthropology class, that has to do with humans. So the word anthro comes from human based climate change. And this lab consists of 4 parts. So we're going to talk about the basic processes involved in the Earth's climate, and then talk about an understanding for the scientific consensus that we do agree that as humans we are warming the Earth a little bit too fast. We are in a warming period. Our Earth goes through cooling and warming periods. Our Earth is in a warming period naturally. So it's warming on its own. The only issue is that humans were speeding up that process and we're making it go too fast, not giving the earth and other things that adapt, like plants and animals, time enough to adjust or evolved to our changing climate. In the last sections, a geographical analysis of 4 measures of global carbon footprints reveal patterns of global emissions and how this is disproportionate and it impacts climate change. So I think it's really important that we make a distinction between this isn't called weather change, it's called climate change. And how long do we have to study weather before a region's climate changes? 30 years. So think about places like Southern California, think about places like Oregon, and go back 30 years. If we were to study the weather every day for 30 years, how would these 30 years be different from the previous 30 years? That's why it's called climate change. We're talking about a very large period of time that goes into the conversation and the structure and the data behind calling something climate change. First, we need to talk about the science of climate and how we use instrumental records. And this data is recorded by measurements. And we're going to go ahead and look at figures 10.1, 10.2, and 10.3. Climate scientists often compute temperature anomalies. So, anomaly is something that's going to be different from the rule. It's going to be a deviation from something that's set. So, to detect temperature trends, despite the variability of geographical conditions that impact the temperature recordings, it's important that scientists look at anomalies, something that was outside of the normal rule, something outside of the normal range. For example, a mountain and a valley will have quite different temperature recordings, but looking at anomalies for both of them will reveal that despite different conditions, both places were warmer than average. So when we learn about something that's different to a set pattern, it helps us find patterns in other locations across the world. Figure 10.1 depicts near identical long-term warming trends in 4 independent data sources. So from NOAAs, we've got NASA, we've got the Japanese Meteorological Agency, and from the UK, their Climate Research Unit. So if we go ahead and take a look at this figure here, we'll notice that these 4 independent recordings look very similar. And for what period of time are we looking at? We're looking at 1880 to 2020. Now, figure 10.2 is going to show the 5-year average variation of global surface temperatures between 1880 and about 2015. It stops here, not all the way to 2020. And since 1970, the years have been increasingly warmer than the 1910 and 2000 average. 9 of the 10 warmest years during this time frame have occurred from 2000, as you can see here, warming, and it's consistent. Figure 10.3 is going to show a map of temperature anomalies relative to the 1951 to 1980 average. So here we're looking at trends in global surface temperature anomalies in 2017 relative to the 1951 and 1980 average. And we're going to notice that there are definitely warming trends almost everywhere around the globe. Next, what you're going to be doing is going to this database. You're going to be searching and naming the city that you live. This database has more than 3,800 global cities. And they show that 83% of those cities experienced higher than normal temperatures in 2018. So you're going to answer these questions based off the information that you find and based off the information of what your particular city is. Climate forcings. What is a climate forcing and why do we discuss this? So the interactions of solar energy with land, air, and water, right, which is all of our spheres, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the hydrosphere, all shape the Earth's climate. The Earth continuously receives energy from the sun, and some of this emitted solar energy reaches the Earth and it goes back to space. But some of this energy stays in the atmosphere and continues to heat the surface of the Earth, the land, and the water. And these processes contribute to the Earth's energy budget. So, for example, pretend like you have a budget. You make a certain amount of money, you spend a certain amount of money, and hopefully at the end of the month, you have a little bit left. But hopefully at the end of the month, your budget balances out. Now, if you're at a deficit, it means that you've spent too much money, money that you don't have. Well, the Earth's energy budget works very much the same. It receives a certain amount of energy, and it should actually release and return and emit back a certain amount of energy. Because what's going to happen if all of the sun's energy comes down to the Earth? Yes, some of it is used, but of the energy that's not used, if it remains near the Earth's surface and within the atmosphere, we're going to have a surplus of energy and therefore a surplus of heat. As the Earth absorbs energy from the sun, it eventually re-emits it into space, but the difference between the incoming and outgoing radiation is known as a planet's radiative forcing. So a climate forcing is a factor impacting this energy budget. When these factors result in incoming energy being greater than outgoing, our planet will warm. So this means to say that if we have more incoming energy than outgoing energy, our planet will warm. So it's simple math, it's a simple budget. Climate scientists have identified factors that influence this forcing or this increase of warmth. Our orbit, our Earth's orbit, our solar output, volcanic activity, and greenhouse gases. In order to better understand all of these combined factors on climate, climatologists at NASA use climate models to test their assumptions. As a part of this climate research, those scientists are combining results from climate models to see how well they can reproduce what's known from the climate from 1850 to 2012. In figure 10.5, this shows the observed global temperatures from 1880 to 2000 in a blue line. The red line is going to show all of these forcings combined. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So from 1880 to about 2000, we're looking at global temperature changes, and we're looking at all of the forcings combined. So all of these forcings are going to be these factors that we've talked about here. Here are some of the other factors that go into this radioactive forcing. But what we're going to notice is that one of the top factors that contributes to this forcing is going to be greenhouse gases. And when we come to modeled human and individual contributions to global temperature changes, we come here also and we look at natural forces, so forces that the earth is involved in, and human forces combined. When we take natural and human together into all forcings, that's a red pinky line, but the human forcings far outweigh the natural forcings that the earth is actually causing the earth to have a larger radioactive forcing, which is means causing our earth to warm. Now, paleoclimatology. This gets into the history of our earth. So on a planet that's more than 4.5 billion years old, human existence is minimal. It's a short glimpse of time. So, when we talk about this vast natural history of the Earth, scientists work really hard to understand the human context by seeking records and clues to our distant past. So, this field of study is dedicated to understanding long-term patterns of the Earth's climate before humans ever even existed. Now, how do we do this? We do this through ice cores. We send these cylinders down into the ice cores, into ice sheets and glaciers, because they act as high time resolution capsules because they freeze samples of what the air was like thousands and thousands of years ago. The deeper scientists drill into this old ice, we get a picture of what the atmosphere looked like thousands of years ago. From some of this information, we're able to extrapolate. So scientists can test the data against other ice core data and other data proxies and set them against the figure of what we're going to see in 10.8. These graphs represent proxy data for more than 63 locations by 8 climate models in a 1,000 year resolution in order to reconstruct 800,000 years of the Earth's climate. So you'll notice that there are big breaks here because this is going to account for if we have year 0 here and year negative 800,000 years. You're going to notice that scientists were able to determine that yes, there were small fluctuations in the Earth's atmosphere in terms of gases, temperature, how often the Earth actually held on to some of that energy and warmed, carbon dioxide concentration fluctuations, and methane, which is another gas as well. And over the course of 800,000 years up until year 0 for what we consider here, the increase that we have in temperature, radiative forcing, CO2 and methane has higher amounts than the earth has ever seen before in 800,000 years. And again, we're going to take a look here at negative 800,000 years, global temperature change, and how we have experienced cooling trends and warming trends. Now we're going to get into anthropogenic climate change. So the term climate change refers to climate changes that occur over, we're talking about long periods of time. So as observed from these data sets, the Earth's temperature is varied from epoch to epoch. And these paleoclimate records show a strong correspondence between temperature and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere observed during glacial cycles over several 100,000 years. So it definitely suggests that we have an increased temperature when we have increased greenhouse gases. And we've seen this over the history of the Earth. And we know that by burning fossil fuels and adding some of these gases into the atmosphere, we're trapping more heat in our atmosphere and causing our weather to increase and then over 30 years to change and to fluctuate faster then it should be warming. So when we have a human-induced temperature increase, we call this anthropogenic climate change. Why does carbon matter? Why does CO2 matter? Carbon dioxide is an abundant greenhouse gas, and the Earth creates it naturally. The Earth creates carbon dioxide in a natural way. The only issue is that now, as humans, we've figured out how to make it. And that is unfortunate because carbon dioxide was created to actually hold on to heat and insulate us on planet Earth and make it nice and warm for us. The only problem is that now we're creating carbon dioxide because carbon is actually a natural compound, but as humans, now we're creating more carbon dioxide. We're putting into the atmosphere. It's doing its job and holding heat and just making the weather warmer. So the CO2 is actually doing its job. Here in this figure 1011, we're looking at the influence of all major human-produced greenhouse gases. Some of the biggest are carbon dioxide, and one of the other large heavy hitters is methane. Other gases, we also have nitrous oxide. We also have another greenhouse gas, which are sulfasalazine and chlorofluorocarbons. So, scientists have long warned about the dangers of unprecedented CO2 concentrations beyond 400 parts per million. Now, if we go ahead and take a look at this graph, we're looking at, so in pink, we've got atmospheric CO2, and then we have CO2 emissions. So, this is from humans. And we're noticing that the emissions from 1750 to I'd say about 1900 from humans was pretty small. It was really insignificant. Then we've got the Industrial Revolution. We start burning fossil fuels in order to get around on planes, trains, and automobiles, and that increased. And with that increase, you're going to notice an increase in atmospheric CO2 simply because if we're putting CO2 in the atmosphere, there's going to be an increase. So we really shouldn't be surprised by that at all. Here we're going to look at a trend of monthly average CO2 from 4 of those same baseline observatories, and you're going to notice an increase. Now, where are these observatories located? Well, they're located in 4 different locations. Here up in Alaska, here in Hawaii, here in America Samoa, and here down in the South Pole and Antarctica. Think for a minute, why do we have our observatories located in those locations? If they're collecting CO2 and recording it in a scientific way, why are we doing that in these 4 locations? What do these 4 locations all have in common? So what do we foresee might happen? Well, let's take a look at some of the visualizations below. So we have some choices here to make as humans. We've got 4 scenarios. We have let's say we enact no climate policies whatsoever. We keep our current policies, or we say we hit our pledges and our targets, or let's say we only increase by 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. What is going to happen? So let's take a look at annual global greenhouse gas emissions based off of those 4 scenarios, which is what happens if we enact no climate policies in the pink, and in the orange, what happens if we keep our current policies, in yellow, if we really aim to keep those pledges and targets that we have sought to enact within our Paris agreements, which said we're going to stay on target with 1.5C and 2C increases only. Now, who can we blame for this increase? Well, globalized industrialization and fossil fuels like burning coal and burning things for electricity and energy is putting more carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. who's responsible? Well, let's try to take a look. In 1017, we're looking at annual emissions by country for 2017. And in the red, we're going to notice these are countries that are emitting the largest amount of carbon dioxide. Now, who emits according to region and who emits according to country? So, who emits the most carbon dioxide, the most CO2? We've got the region of Asia here, which is represented in red. We have North America here represented in green. We've got the continent of Africa down here in blue, which is very small. We have South America in this light green color, Australia in purple, and we have Europe here in yellow. And some of the larger countries are represented by name, but they're represented by color according to region. And then in your lab, you're going to go ahead and fill in that chart according to what you've seen in that diagram. Here is another way of looking at the annual CO2 emissions by region. According to region again, we're just showing this in a different trend. Let's go ahead and take a look at figure 1020. This is talking about per capita, so per person CO2 emissions for 2018. Now this map's going to look a little bit different because this is going to represent how much CO2 each human in these regions is emitting. So some of our largest, as we're going to notice here, United States, Saudi Arabia, that's Kazakhstan, Russia, and we also have Australia. Again, here's another way of visualizing that as well. CO2 emissions per capita versus the gross domestic product per capita for 2016. So again, we're seeing the United States is up there pretty high as well. China, India is down a little bit lower. You're also going to see some other nations because their per capita per person is so high. You've got places like Norway, and the reason why they're up there so high in terms of being over on this side is actually because everyone lives a pretty nice life in Norway. So this is telling you that people in Norway, out of everyone else in the world, actually make the most money out of any human. So per person, the country who has people making consistently the most amount of money is Norway. But they are still below their CO2 emissions, lower than United States, lower than Japan, lower than Poland, and they're pretty much right on track with China. This map 2020 or 1024 is showing cumulative CO2 emissions from 1751 through 2018. And why they're trying to record this is they're trying to look at the long-term perspective in terms of carbon dioxide emissions from the start of the Industrial Revolution when we started burning fossil fuels. Now, this figure 1025 looks at the share of global cumulative CO2 emissions. So that same sort of data, except represented in a line graph. And we're looking at really the inverse is pretty interesting here from 1751 through 2017. So the United States actually had a very low emission rate as of 1800. Well, that makes sense because there was very little population here in the 1800s, correct? And obviously, it peaked in the 1950s and then it's come down a little bit. Now, part D, let's talk about climate justice. So, given the realities of climate impacts, global movements have focused on climate justice. Now, means that what other countries are doing is unfair to countries that really are not emitting a whole lot of carbon. So let's go ahead and take a look at the amount of global CO2 emissions by income group. So it's really what we're going to discover is that the people who make the most money generally are using and emitting the most carbon dioxide. But unfortunately, the other end of the scale, the people who are not emitting CO2 are unfortunately on the end of those influences more often than not. So let's take a look at global CO2 emissions by region. And we're going to notice here, over here, per capita, with the highest, we've got North America, and the lowest over here with the continent of Africa. And figure 10.2.8 is going to show a map of the World Bank's income groups for reference. Well, that lines up pretty nicely. So in the continent of Africa, they have the lowest amount of emissions. They also have the lowest amount of income. So what are some of the economic impacts of climate change? So for decades, the International Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, has reported that the impacts of a warming planet continue to trigger climate changes on a global, regional, and local scale. We've got sea level rise, we have glaciers melting, flooding, drought, and a loss of terrestrial and marine biodiversity, increased frequency and intensity of megafires, hurricanes, storms, heat waves, and more land that has become uninhabitable. So, this has become a disrupted global climate system, and these areas are going to vary geographically. So, there are many ways that geographers and other scientists study the distribution of these impacts. And often researchers utilize climate projection data sets in order to project what, in fact, might happen. So, this is going to be one of those maps where scientists are working in figure 1029 to look at the economic impact of if our world warms by 2 degrees Celsius and who is going to be impacted. And who's going to be impacted the most are going to be the places that actually emit the least amount of carbon. Another economic measure of climate crisis is to look at its impact on global poverty. Low-income countries are less able to adapt to the challenges of any sort of change. It makes it more difficult when you don't have money to help adapt to a climate that is changing. And NASA explains that as our regions' climates are shifting, there's a difference between how we can mitigate and adapt. So, for example, in the United States, what does adapting mean? Adapting means that we can afford air conditioners. Adapting means that we can afford ways of building that helps us build environments where we can actually live. It also means that the amount of water that's available is going to change as well. So for those of us who live in places that can afford to alter our water or where our water comes from, that won't be difficult for us. But in places where they're unable to afford that sort of infrastructure, adjusting and adapting to these changing climates, both in water resource and temperature resource, is going to become more difficult. That is the end of this lecture series. At the end of your lab, you're going to have a few questions for reflection. Please make sure that you answer those, and I'll talk to you soon.